Stephanie, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Brody. It's so good to see you again.
It's so awesome to see you as well. I wanted to kind of recant for the listeners and for myself as well, kind of how we originally met. I know had pretty bad brain trauma and I was trying to heal that, and you were working with Dr. Michael Trayford at his place, and we met through that. I think it was what, 2017, 2018, somewhere in
Yeah,
there.
probably around 2018. So it's been a little while. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a little while, and I mean, you've probably noticed the difference in me because at that time, I had pretty bad brain fog. I was getting a little bit better, but at the same time, I wasn't able to piece my words together as well as I would like to, and some other things. If you can remember that.
Yeah, yeah, and it has been amazing to watch you transform and excel and just see everything that you're doing now, all of your videos and helping other people understand, just using your story, I think, and helping people acknowledge and reflect on these things and be able to integrate these exercises into their daily life is huge. So I've enjoyed watching you grow in this way.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I wanted to focus more on you and your story as you as a guest. And how was your childhood growing up? What was it like for you as a young adult? And how did you eventually get into the holistic space?
I um I had a rough childhood. There was a lot of neglect and abuse in my childhood home. There were a lot of drugs. And I actually ended up going to massage school when I was 18. And I think looking back, I think that we give what we need. I think that we really like fall into careers where we're able to give others what we needed. And I think that I really needed safe touch. And I didn't know that so much at the time. I knew that my nervous system and my body and my brain really appreciated gentle, soft touch. So I knew
Yeah.
that I was going to be getting a lot of massage in in massage school. But it's just been, over the past 20 years or so, how I've recognized how necessary it was in helping my nervous system calm down from what had been happening in my childhood. I experienced a lot of sexual abuse in my childhood, which continued into my adult years. And I wasn't aware really of what was going on. I knew that it was bad. I knew
Yeah.
it wasn't as bad as other people's experience, and I knew it was far worse than a lot of people's experience. But I also didn't understand healthy coping mechanisms. So I engaged in a lot of keeping myself busy and strong and just pushing through it,
Yeah.
avoiding everything, whether it was through overachieving, drinking. Alcohol was a huge part of my life in my early 20s, and doing pills and smoking marijuana, different things to continue numbing myself. And I thought that that was the strong way to deal with things. Um, so I ended up really choosing a more holistic route for my healing, my grief, and my sexual trauma because of what I saw happening in my childhood home. My brother was actually medicated at 4 years old in 1990. He was put on Ritalin, and from yeah, from that age, he continued to be medicated throughout his life. And what I've seen a lot of both in my childhood, my career, for 20 years as a massage therapist, my education, my volunteer experience, there is such an under investigation of what is actually happening inside the home. And there's an over medication of individuals. And now it's far worse, than it was when I was younger, but I saw firsthand the detrimental impacts of medical professionals not asking more questions,
Mhm.
adults looking the other way about abuse that was happening in the home, and the quick fix that medication can be. and oftentimes has become. So I have a very personal stance on this, and because of the ways I saw my personal family deteriorate due to um just over medication, I really was like, I'm not going to do that. I didn't want to use medication to deal with anxiety, to deal with depression and all of those things. And I also didn't have health insurance, I still don't
Mm.
have health insurance. So over the years I've had to get very crafty, and very vulnerable, and just willing to be open-minded with the different things that I'm going to try. I did try therapy a little bit in my early 20s,
Mhm.
and it felt very disempowering for me. I was really not happy with the therapist that I saw.
Mhm.
There was a lot of pushing of the model of disease on me, which did not resonate with me. And I felt like there was so much more to what was happening with me, knowing what I had endured. And I didn't feel like the professionals that I was connecting with were able to like dig deeper around that. So I just, being in the massage realm, being in the um, alternative health arena, it allowed me to focus on body work. It allowed me to look into all of these other things that are not very mainstream, that people
Mhm.
don't necessarily talk about, that there are a lot of stigmas against. But getting into that field, getting into the massage field, I really do think saved my life. Um, as somebody who spent decades avoiding being in my body,
Mhm.
because when you're enduring sexual trauma, you dissociate, you go somewhere else. I had to learn to come back to being in my body. And for many years, alcohol was a coping mechanism. It was a soothing mechanism
Mhm.
because I didn't feel right in my body, and I didn't feel right in social situations. I didn't feel right being myself. Um, and I don't hold shame over myself anymore for the
Yeah.
ways that I coped, because a lot of people use those coping mechanisms because that's what's reinforced by society. It's
Mhm.
acceptable.
Yeah.
Um, but being in the massage realm, it brought me back to my body in a safe way. It taught me how to have boundaries, for my body, for my life. It taught me how to advocate for myself and just use my voice in a way that started to become safer. Which I'm a huge believer that grief and sexual trauma, those two things separate us from our body, from our spirit, from our voice. And if you cannot advocate for yourself in your life, you're not living your life fully.
Mhm. Thank you, first of all, for sharing that, and a very courageous, and impactful story that you were able to take all of that really tough stuff that you talked about and turn it into a positive. And it's amazing that you found massage is somewhat of your saving grace there. Um, and for me, it was meditation that saved that really was my saving grace, and with the alcohol, the drugs, and I too kind of shamed myself a lot about why I got into alcohol and drugs, but honestly, there was not a lot of other options there for me. I didn't know about any of this stuff. And so it's so good to like leave that behind and say, okay, I was doing the best that I was doing that I could do at that time, which was doing alcohol and drugs and stuff of that nature. So,
Well, and it is even though it's detrimental, it's soothing to our nervous system in the moment,
yeah.
and while I'm very much an advocate for holistic wellness, please know I spent my years engaging in detrimental activities, that further put me into situations that I didn't know how to advocate for myself. So that just it layered on, the different forms of trauma, that I now, have been working for years through. And shame is a huge one. And just having compassion for my younger self. I didn't know those things then, and that's why we do this work, is to help under other people understand,
Mhm.
hey, like these are some behaviors and things you might be engaging in, that, here's a much better alternative, because people just don't know.
It's so true. I wanted to dive a little more deeper into trauma and into uh, healing, and also when it comes to grief. Grief is how are like trauma and grief connected, and what are some ways that we can begin to work through our different types of grief?
That's that is a great question. And there's a lot of different definitions for trauma, I think. For me, it is a deeply stressful experience that we were not necessarily able to process in the moment. We carry that with us, and we carry that grief with us.
Hmm.
And we carry grief and trauma in our body. I know this as a massage therapist. I know this as, just through my education. Um, and that is why a lot of talk therapy and medication is not helping to move people forward, is because they're not engaging the body in the healing process. And that's why things like body work, nutrition, exercise and movement, meditation, it's why all of those things are so important. Um, I think that every human on earth carries grief from our experiences. There is no one soul on this earth that gets out without the human experience of
Right.
grief. And it's all unique, but it is also common. We're all navigating these things, and I think that we don't have supportive systems in place to recognize when people are struggling. I think that we are quick to medicate
Hmm.
versus talking about our feelings. People get very uncomfortable when you want to talk about feelings. They get very uncomfortable with people displaying emotions, which we are human beings. And, one of the things that I hear most often from my clients, because my massage practice is centered around helping women navigate grief and the impacts of sexual trauma. And what I hear most often from people that have recently lost somebody is they don't feel like they can grieve properly because they have to be strong for everybody else.
Mm.
Meanwhile, everybody else is also trying to be strong, and we're all just collectively um, disowning our human emotions. And that eventually will impact us physiologically,
Hmm.
which impacts us emotionally, it impacts us spiritually. Um, indigenous communities believe in something called soul loss. So when we experience something traumatic, i- and anybody that's listening can think about maybe a phone call they received they weren't ready for, or something that has happened in their life, and it is a shock. It's a shock to your body, to your nervous system, to your mind, to your spirit. So indigenous communities believe that that shock shatters our spirit. It leaves like slivers of our spirit in those places where these things happen. And that is the basis for physiological and emotional despair, dis-ease in our world. And we have to go back to those places and recollect our spirit, and do that work of like bringing our soul back together to feel complete. And body work is a really beautiful way to be doing that, to be dealing with grief. um a lot of times when somebody is grieving, they don't feel like they have anybody to talk to, or they don't know how to communicate what's happening for them. They feel utterly alone. They want to keep up the persona of I'm strong, I can get through this. And because we're doing all that kind of behind the scenes, it's also being reinforced by culture and society that there are other ways to get through it, whether it's drinking or working harder or spending your money or anything like that. And yeah, you can do those things, but in the long run, there's typically more you're going to have to heal from. You know what I mean? Like we layer it up, and finding finding more therapeutic ways to deal um with grief and trauma is what I want to help women do while they're younger,
Mhm.
because you hit 40 and your body just starts to move differently. It starts to feel differently. Things that, didn't hurt you before, now like your body's reacting to.
Mhm.
Um, we do live in a world that's full of a lot of toxins, and there is only so much we can do. So the more that we can engage in healthy coping mechanisms to deal with grief and trauma, the better that's going to be for us. And I do want to say, when we talk about trauma, a lot of people immediately think of um, maybe a horrific accident, or it doesn't always have to be something huge.
Right.
Having a parent that is criticizing and a perfectionist can do severe damage to the developing brain,
Definitely.
and it bleeds into our behaviors. And we become this people pleaser, and nothing's ever good enough, and we shame ourselves for the smallest mistakes. Like there's so many different ways that trauma presents in our life. So it doesn't necessarily have to be physical or emotional abuse in childhood. There's a lot of different ways that we can experience trauma. And if we don't have a supportive family environment or a supportive caregiver to help us understand what's happening, talk about our emotions, allow us to grieve without shaming, that it just compounds. And then we bring those fears and inadequacies into our relationships
Mhm.
and into our career and into the way that we care for and nourish our bodies. So there's oh, um, birds out there.
Okay. It's so interesting and fascinating, with grief especially. I feel, and maybe this is just me, but a misconception of grief is that you, um that time heals all. I don't necessarily believe that. Yeah, of course, eventually time heals all, but it's about wanting, like, I don't it's fear and grief. Like, there's a lot of fear around grief, and I'll be quite honest, I don't understand it very well, and I kind of fear it. So, um, I guess maybe accepting that it's a human experience is the start.
Yeah, and thank you for just being honest about that, because as women, it's more acceptable, right, for us to feel our grief and express our emotions. Whereas men have a completely different approach to these things. There's a lot more stigmas, for men um, being able to express and release grief. And yeah, I think that being in our body and feeling those difficult emotions that we all as humans feel, it is scary, because a lot of us have been taught how to avoid really feeling in our body, whether it's because we're consuming food to, like, we're emotionally eating, or we're drinking, or we're an athlete who has been taught to dismiss our pain in our body. I've worked with a
Right.
lot of women who are athletes, and they are taught to dismiss your tiredness, dismiss your pain, dismiss your hungriness. So there's just like there's a million ways throughout the educational system, the medical system, the judicial system, that we are taught to avoid reality. I
Mhm.
mean, we are. So it's not weird that you have fear around grief at all. I think that that is very common, and I think that there's so few people able to talk about it. and willing to talk about it, but I also know that not having this conversation is a disservice to people that are hurting silently, um, that are watching. Um, I know when I was younger, I used to see women talking about their sexual trauma experience, and it was not very common 20 years ago to see women talking about this.
Mm.
But I always was like, oh my God, like I can't believe she's saying this out loud, and now I say these things out loud because I know how many women are dependent upon my willingness to be vulnerable about my experience, whether that's my sexual trauma
Mhm.
or it's my grief. Um, I've been very open about my story on social media because my work with women, it is very personal. It's very soul led, and I cannot effectively help other women if I am not being authentic and raw about the things that I've been through. And that's why I do talk about, the holistic realm, is because I have tried so many of these things. I've seen what works for clients and for myself, and I've seen what doesn't typically. And this, I mean, people don't get into the holistic realm when other stuff is working. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
there's a lot of stigmas around holistic wellness and a lot of the things that I do, but if other stuff had been working, because there are people on medications, is it working, or is it helping to keep them numb and dissociated? Because I've had a lot of conversations with people that are on medication and they don't feel good and they're not progressing and they're not able to speak about their story without shame.
Mm.
Um,
Mhm.
so how much like are we helping people with all the medication?
AA comes to my mind, AANA, and it didn't work for me because when I go there, I just felt a sense of shame, and I was like, "Hi, I'm Brody, and I'm alcoholic." I do identify as an alcoholic, but I do not identify that as a large part of my essence and my being.
Mm.
And so when if I go to AA consistently and keep reinforcing that all I am is an alcoholic who's just trying to get by, just like you were talking about, just to get by in a way. People take pills just to get by. I don't think that's a empowering way of living.
I thank you for saying that because I completely agree, and I never did AA, even though my drinking got quite excessive when I was younger. I did not resonate with the I am powerless. I am powerless over this thing, and I thought, no,
Hmm.
no, like that just does not. I had a therapist that was trying to say like, oh, you have this disease, and I was like, absolutely not. And this is, you know if it works for somebody, keep doing it. Do what works for you. But for me,
Exactly.
for you, it did not resonate. I am a very resilient person, and it's taken me a long time to just admit that freely because um, I don't I don't know, because a lot of people don't always want to move forward out of their pain and suffering, and that is a very difficult thing to say and maybe to hear.
Yeah.
But our stories of lack, our self narratives of victimhood, a lot of those things serve in the way that we don't have to move forward. We don't have to let go of certain people. We don't have to try harder. Um, there are a lot of ways that our stories and narratives can hold us back. And I think that our words are very powerful. And I was not interested in saying, I'm powerless over this. Like, I think that I have power inside, and I'm going to figure out how and where and how to, best utilize it, because there are so many stories of people out there that persevere after trauma, after a bad childhood, after a loss, after a significant disability. There are a lot of beautiful stories of the way that human beings can rise up. And that's what I want my story to be. Um,
And you bring up such a great point too, that we all have these disempowering narratives, whether we realize it or not. And there's no perfection in this life. I still have certain limiting perceptions about life that I'm trying to work through the best way that I can. And you're right, it almost feels like a safe space, that when you can go to that place of victimhood, or you can go blame it on the next person or the next thing, it feels safe. And so it's there's no shame there. It's just identifying
mm.
those things that you do hold on to and doing your best to move past them, right?
That yeah, what you just said about that being like a safe space for us because there isn't shame there because we know that narrative. And
Mhm,
that's when you are stepping into new versions of yourself, there is grief. That's something that I, really want people to understand is grief is not just loss of a loved one. Grief is loss of ourself, like
mhm,
loss of our youth that we didn't know that there were other options to drinking and we missed out on a lot of beautiful things that we could have experienced younger. We suffered in a lot of the ways that we didn't necessarily have to if we'd had this information. So there is grief in moving forward, and because there's so much fear around grief, people would rather sit in that discomfort of the knowing
mhm.
versus the discomfort of the unknown.
Yes.
And you can see that, and those types of things, those mentalities and those behaviors and that lack of action is handed down in families as well. So there's grief, being the one in your family that decides I'm not going to live like this.
Mhm,
I've had a strange, my father and my brother are gone now. I have, mostly estrangement from the rest of my family. And
mhm.
there is grief in that, because I've chosen to live my life differently. Um, I think like some kids see what they want to be when they grow up, kind of thing. And, it's difficult to say this, but I saw a lot of what I didn't want to be. I saw a lot of things that I did not want in my home, in my body, in my behaviors. I saw that growing up and I was like, well, you better do something about it. I didn't have somebody to teach me. So being very curious and being open-minded, being willing to stray from mainstream, you know, narratives. Um, it's tough because there are going to be naysayers. There are going to be people that don't like you. There are going to be people that tell you you're going to fail or that you're stuck up or, just trying to get into your head about like, you can't do this kind of thing. But I can, and so can other people. Um, yeah. So when we talk about grief and trauma, I mean, that in itself, like just choosing to live your life differently, choosing a different narrative, killing off those parts of our ego and our previous self, there's grief there. You're, dissecting from former versions of yourself. And that is something that's something that we can grieve.
Definitely. And you mentioned about it kind of being a little bit of a lonely road when you step out into this unknown, this new part of me that is different from what most of society is doing. What's different than your friends or ex-friends. I have a lot of friends that I called them at that time when I was in drugs and alcohol, but they didn't really have my back. And it's not guilting or shaming them. It's just saying, hey, I found a different way, and I have to stand there, and sometimes it does come with accusations by your family, or it comes with people accusing you that don't know you, what you're doing, and your motives. And that can be the most hurtful part of all that, or the most difficult part sometimes, is people trying to accuse me of trying to manipulate people, or wild stuff like that. when really all I'm trying to do is help.
It's yeah, I'm glad that you said that, because I think that there is I'm a helper. There's a lot of helpers out there, and not everybody wants help. And I've had to, like, something that I've also grieved. I've a lot of different things I've grieved in my life, but
Yeah,
grieving the people that don't want help. I personally, I don't know why anybody wants to suffer more than they need to, but I
right.
understand it because I was also there at one point in my life. I was there, in my 20s. I was in an abusive relationship. I was engaging in a lot of drug use. You know what I mean? I was suffering. Um, I think that it is difficult to watch other people suffer. And I've heard from people like, oh, this is a you problem. Like, you need to work on yourself more. And I'm like, no, I'm not I'm never going to be that friend that's going to sugarcoat stuff for my people
Mhm.
or not hold them accountable, because I can see the ways in which they can improve and suffer less. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that there needs to be more of that in our society, because a lot of things in our society right now ask us to look the other way and to just be nice. And
Mhm.
I think there's a real problem with that. I'm a very kind individual. I have a very good heart, but I'm not just going to be nice to keep the peace anymore, because I did
Right.
that for decades, and it impacts my physiological health. It impacts my emotional health. And I have very much gotten into the chapter in my life that if I'm speaking truth to somebody, they need to hear it. Maybe they do
Mhm.
need to hear it. And I think there's a lot of ways that we diminish ourselves because being more asks other people to also be more. And that is uncomfortable. And when you're doing it alone, um, yeah, you do have a lot of like narratives around like second guessing yourself, and maybe they're right, and why do I have to be like this, kind of thing. But also, if you're feeling that fire to move through the world in a different way, there's a reason, because you are here to show other people that that's possible. And I
Mhm.
don't think that we should dim ourselves from that.
Definitely. I can't look the other way. If I'm watching something bad happening, I cannot look the other way morally, because if I do, then I go back to my lies and the drinking and deception. And so I for my own sake, I have to speak what I believe is right in my heart.
Yeah. I love and appreciate that about you, and I think that is part of our connection. We do have these like incredible conversations, and I think mine goes to, and this helps me remember that I have a job here to do. I suffered immensely as a child because grown adults looked the other way, and they were too scared to put a stop to abuse. They were too scared to speak up. They were too scared to shed a light on the things that was happening in my life. And I will never, I will never be that woman. And I don't apologize for that anymore. I volunteer as a child advocate with Buncombe County.
Mhm.
So I am speaking in the courtroom for abused and neglected kids.
That's
And
amazing.
I've been doing that for 6 years. And the devastation that little humans endure because of grown adults looking the other way and not doing the right thing
Mhm.
is, I mean, it is just like utterly heartbreaking. And I don't want to be that person. I'll take the hate. Like, I'll take the
Yeah,
criticism.
yeah.
I'll take
Mhm.
the what, because usually it's coming from somebody behind a keyboard. Like, what are you doing in your community? What are you doing to lift yourself out of the old narratives, kind of thing? Because it's not easy. Um, and it does feel lonely, and there is a lot of grief associated with like becoming who you are meant to be on this earth. I really don't think that it's an easy process. It is very fulfilling. It
Is.
is very beautiful,
Mhm,
and it is incredibly difficult because you have to shed old friends, you have to shed old homes, you have to shed old jobs, like, you have to be willing to jump into the unknown
mhm.
without a safety net and have that trust, like, in yourself, and have connection to a higher power. So yeah, there's a lot of grief in that, and that can feel traumatic, like losing people that we've known. So the trauma and the grief are like so tightly intertwined.
Yeah, they really are, and, but it's so awesome that we're having these conversations because this is the start of changing that narrative. This is the start. As you mentioned, you have to change yourself first, like in order to want to see a change in the world. So us actually having this conversation and allowing people to know that it's okay to speak about your feelings and stuff like that. So I wanted to kind of move on a little bit and more into astrology because I'm very into energy and how I feel. And I've done a lot of studies on quantum physics and science, and it all just made sense to me. And how we all are interconnected, and some people can feel that, but then really actually knowing that is really cool. And so a little off topic, but I wanted to talk about how the moon affects us because recently there was a full moon and I seem to lose my marbles, so to speak, a lot of times when the full moon comes around. I like get super emotional. I get like super lots of negative thinking and old patterns start to show
Mm.
up. Um and there during COVID, I wanted like I think there's a full moon and I would just lost my shit like a lot of people. And I ran in the middle of the street in my boxers and my wife was trying to chase me down. But like I just want to know, long story short, like, does like the moon, how can we explain how like the moon makes me feel more anxiety and more pain? I just trying to understand that a little bit better.
So I am incorporating astrology into my massage practice. I'm incorporating astrology, medical astrology, and herbalism into my massage practice and my coaching practice to better support clients in a body, mind, spirit totality.
Mhm.
And I kind of fell into astrology, I would say about 3 or 4 years ago. And I have been deeply getting into it the past 3 years and starting to understand how this really is real in our life, how our natal chart matters, how the moon affects our emotions and everything.
Mhm.
And I, I am so glad to hear you say that, like, you have these past narratives come up because the full moon is about shedding light, right? Like, it's full. That light, one, keeps us awake a little bit more at night, but it's shedding a light on all the things and areas that we're ready to release. We plant seeds and write intentions with the new moon, so the dark sky, but then within like 6 months, that typically comes to fruition. And the moon is associated with our emotions. It's associated with the way that we nurture ourselves, the way that we nurture others. So you are not alone in having, those feelings around the full moon. I think we all very much feel that. And that's the thing is, there are a lot of stigmas around astrology, but the planets impact all of us. It is it impacts the masses,
Yeah.
because there is something to it, and we all have a natal chart. It's unique to the exact moment that we take our breath.
And you
um
wouldn't say that about the sun. Oh, the sun, you're gonna go sit out in front of the sun and say it doesn't impact you? Are you gonna get like all red and tan and and like why do we discount the moon, which is even closer than the sun to us? How that doesn't it just I guess I don't know why there's just such a narrative to like keep people from understanding that. And thank you so much for explaining how the moon is like old stuff that we want to release, because that makes a lot more sense in my life. And I just want to bring up about the moon real quick that our brain is mostly water, 70 to 8%, depends on who you talk to. Our body is mostly water. And look how the moon impacts tides, and tell me, if you are water, if you're mostly water, how that's not going to impact you as well. So
Pulls it up. And I think that, with relation to grief and trauma, one of the things that has really helped me is one, getting in nature, two, using nature through nourishment and herbalism. But when we have a greater understanding of the cyclical processes, like the phases of the moon, like the planting season, the harvesting season, all of that, when we're in connection with Mother Nature, we have a greater capacity to understand the seasons and cycles of life. And we've become so heavily dependent upon going to the grocery store and getting something in a box. We do not recognize the importance of working with the land, and we do not see, firsthand that um, nothing can be born without the death of something else. We can't nourish ourselves without the death of something. I was out in the woods this past weekend. We had a fire, and there was all these trees that had fallen down. They're dead, right? But they're growing mushrooms and moss, and there's plants growing out of them. So when you immerse yourself in nature, and when you intentionally use nature as a healing tool, you can really dive into those introspective thoughts about, like, the relation between grief and trauma and nature. um and yeah, there's so many fascinating things to be learned around astrology, and the moon especially. I Like I said, I've been getting deeply into it. My moon is located in my fifth house. No, I'm sorry. My 10th house, which is business and stuff. And I was like, oh, that makes sense. I'm an emotional person and everything with business. But I'm like, no, Stephanie, this is how you nurture people. Like, you nurture people in your business. That's what you do. So having more clarity around our natal chart and understanding when the planets are transiting, like where everything is lighting up our natal chart, can be a massively healing, and positive coping mechanism to navigate the grief in our life, because there's always going to be grief in our life. As human beings, we are going to continue experiencing grief, and it might not be the loss of somebody, but we're going to go through different trials in our relationship, just with our partner. Like that alone, we go through ebbs and flows. We go through mountains and valleys, and you know what I mean? So and sometimes this is something that, like, a lot of people are going through at once. So if we can harness our ability to be curious, be vulnerable, and believe these things that have been deemed as pseudoscience and woo woo stuff. You know what I mean? Like, if it can help you, who cares? If it can help you, who cares? Because if you look at, what's going on in the world, there's a lot of ways to feel fear on a daily basis. There's a lot of ways to place blame on somebody outside of yourself. There's a lot of ways to get out of accountability for the way that we live our lives.
Right.
um it's few and far in between where you can find stuff that's hopeful, and that gives you a faith, and like strengthens your faith. And I think that, I don't care if it's woo woo or not. I mean, it works for me, and I've seen my life up level immensely,
Oh,
by doing holistic work. So
mm. And I mean, we're meaning making machines, and so meaning in our story is more powerful than anything out
yes.
there. Is our meaning and story. what are some suggestions you could give to others that are struggling that recently lost a loved one? And how can they really learn to open their heart again through something that really is so tough and closes you up?
Um, there is nothing worse than losing somebody. Losing people we love in our lives is it's absolutely horrific, um to have to accept that they are not here on this plane anymore. But I think that the more you can be curious about what else is there, um, time is not necessarily linear and energy does not die. It just transforms. And I think that, whether you find a belief in God or some kind of divine power, I think understanding that our loved ones are still there, I think that's very important. And I think that's a very scary thing for some people to
Mm,
even attempt to investigate. But I will say, um, it has been, the passing of several loved ones that has helped me really connect with my intuition and have this sense of knowing that they're still there. It has been nature which
mm.
has shown me signs. I believe in signs from our angels because I have received so many things that absolutely cannot be deemed a coincidence. It just can't.
Wow.
There are only I love science. There are only so many things um that science can do. And I think that we are intuitive beings. We do have a soul. And I think the more that we can lean into that and believe, you know, um, if you've lost somebody, asking your loved one for a sign. Make it a wild sign that you're not going to see in everyday traffic. You know what I mean? And just see how I was like asking for a sign one day and I was like, all right, show me a hippopotamus because I'm like, where in Asheville am I going to see a hippopotamus? And I pulled up Facebook that day and there was a skeleton of a hippopotamus, which I studied forensic anthropology. So I was like, oh,
Wow.
this is definitely for me kind of thing. Um, there are some really beautiful books out there, that deal with grieving loved ones. Signs is a great book and it was really beautiful. Um, Nourishing ourselves through loss is so incredibly important. We are and I have done this in my past, we're quick to drink through it, we're quick to emotionally eat, and just engage in behaviors that do not serve our mental health. um,
Mhm,
Food is our mood,
mhm,
and the more that you can nourish your body, the better off you're going to be able to process emotions. When we're eating a diet that is heavily processed, it it is numbing. It's not real in our body. When we're eating nourishing foods, and I hear this from a lot of people, when they change their diet and they start eating more produce, more whole foods, they feel a difference in their emotions. So that is a way to tap into your body and be able to feel those scary emotions, and whether you do it in private or you reach out to a trusted person, I think that that's really really important. um Losing somebody, we feel so alone in that loss, and I think that if you are a strong person, if you're a resilient person, people aren't necessarily checking on you. When I lost my brother, um I, man, I was just like a ping pong ball between drinking on my bathroom floor and then like getting up at 5 a.m. and going to the gym and doing all the things that I had to do. But like people weren't really checking on me because they're
right.
like, oh, she's strong. But I mean, I was drowning emotionally because I was reviewing the abuse in our childhood. I had just taken the volunteer position as a child advocate. So we were talking about abuse in the home and what to do.
Right.
And I just started a job as a nanny. So I was caring for another child that was 2 years old, 50 hours a week. I was drowning and my husband didn't even see it, you know? So I think finding, even if it's just one person that you can be vulnerable with,
Mhm.
um, if you don't have that, you can journal. If you need help, there is a helpline. You can call 988 anywhere in the world, anytime, and be connected with somebody to talk about your emotional health. Um, and I think, having grace for yourself, because when we lose somebody, there's a lot of guilt around usually what we didn't do or say right. I was drowning in the waters of guilt and shame when my brother died.
Mm,
Um, it looked like an accident. I Nothing set right with me, and then I always question like what happened. And then 3 years later, I connected with his girlfriend at the time, who let me know that they had had a massive fight the day before, and she sent me the text messages that he had written about committing suicide. So I ended up having to re-grieve it from that deep knowing that I'd had the entire time. Um, and there was a ton of guilt about the fights that we'd had, the things that I said, the way I didn't save him as a kid. A lot of shame, that I had to work through. And ultimately, what I know from that experience is, you cannot hang yourself out to dry for the things that you didn't know. And you have to have compassion for yourself. And I do think that, the amount of losses I've experienced have helped me live harder and more fully. Some people do shut down to life, but I see this as a reminder that it's quick. It's quick, and we're going to be gone soon, So, like, what do you want your legacy to be? I think, I'm a doer. So my business was born out of my brother's death. It was born out of my brother's death, my father's traumatic brain injury. I've lost girlfriends to cancer. I've
mm.
had several miscarriages, so my business was really born out of all of that grief and pain. Um, so I do think that, again, death and birth, like those cycles, like what do we want those stories to mean to us? How do we want to carry those people forward? Because we're all going to lose somebody.
Mm.
And I think that, we do have the opportunity to like keep their spirit alive in a beneficial way, no matter what they were doing on this earth. Um, so
I love that. Thank you so much for coming on here. It's been such a wonderful learning experience, such a so much courage, so much bravery shown by you, and thank you so much for spreading your story because I know this is going to help people. And as you said, it was birthed out of very difficult things, but now you're turning all this tough stuff into something beautiful, and so it's almost like a butterfly in a way. So um, thank you so much for coming on. And if people um are wanting to reach out to you, where can they do that?
yeah, I'm on Instagram at Intentional Holistic Healing, and you can email me, Stephanie at intentionalholistichealing.com. I'm on Facebook, I'm on TikTok. So yeah, I'm mostly on Instagram. Come send me a DM there. And I'm doing massage here in Hendersonville, North Carolina. I am offering goddess astrology insight and natal chart guidance, and I'm also going to be starting to get into herbalism, to support my clients with tinctures and stuff like that. So, and I do offer coaching as well. So working with women navigating holistic healing and the impacts of sexual trauma and grief.
Amazing, Stephanie. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, and I hope to have you on another time somewhere down the road. So
Thank you, Brody. I love our conversations. Thank
Likewise.
you.